welcome back to Food to Go, the podcast brought to you by the New Food team in association with Merck. My name is Grace Galler and I am the assistant editor of New Food, and I will be your host for today's podcast. Today we're bringing you the second part of our conversation with the FSA. In this episode, I speak to Emily Miles, Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency, about two topics that have been making headlines recently, and they are food fraud and allergy safety. If you missed the first part of our conversation, then please do give it a listen. The link is in the description of this episode. But if you've already heard that, then I expect you're eagerly awaiting the next instalment of our conversation. So without further ado, let's get straight into part 2 of our chat with Emily. Welcome back to Food to Go and to the second part of our conversation with the FSA. I am here with Emily Miles, Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency. How are you doing, Emily?
Really good, thanks, Grace.
Brilliant. If you missed our first discussion, then please do go over to the New Food website where you can listen to exactly what Emily and I spoke about in the last episode. But today I'm here to discuss with Emily two topics that are of real interest to New Food readers, and they are food fraud and allergen safety. We're actually recording this episode during Allergy Awareness Week, so what better time to pick Emily's brains about what the FSA is doing to support those living with food hypersensitivity and food businesses alike. But without further ado, let's dive straight into the big conversation surrounding food fraud. Emily, one topic that's frequently on the minds of New Food readers is food fraud. And as the UK's food regulatory body, how would you describe the current food fraud landscape in 2024 compared to previous years?
I mean, we do an annual report on food standards, and we think that the UK has some of the safest and most authentic food in the world. So we recently published data from our retail surveillance survey, which said that 97% of the foods we tested for authenticity were what they said they were. And often where those breaches were happening, if they weren't quite what they said they were to do with sort of slightly minor things about amounts and content. And this is about a very small minority of actors, but there are risks of criminality in the food system. There are criminals who want to break the rules. And so we just have to keep an eye on the system to make sure that that's not possible. I mean, people have always sought to profit from inauthentic food. I mean, the whole food regulatory system, which was established in the 19th century, was in response to cutting dodgy things into food and claiming it was something that it wasn't. And these days, food comes in very long and complex supply chains, and it's hard for consumers to tell if some foods like herbs and spices are authentic, particularly if they've been incorporated at the manufacturing stage. So I think the onus really is on food businesses to take this really seriously and check their own supply chains. Businesses have they've got a legal responsibility to sell safe and authentic food, and there's actually lots that they can do to assure standards, from sampling and sharing sampling with other businesses. And then we also at the FSA coordinate sampling, and then there's checks undertaken by local authorities. So there's a lot that goes on. I feel like we have good systems in place. We are confident that we've got some of the most authentic food in the world, but there are risks of bad actors.
I want to talk about the work that the FSA has been doing in recent months in the fight against food fraud. So recently you launched a new free food fraud hotline. That's a bit of a mouthful to say. How do you plan to ensure that the confidentiality and protection of whistleblowers, and what steps are being taken to encourage more people to report food crime in 2024?
We thought this was really important. We rely at the FSA on intelligence to take action. So we rely a lot on local authorities who are the going out and doing inspections, but we also rely on people from food businesses telling us when they're worried about something. That's always been the case, but we were aware last year that perhaps not as many people knew that they could and should report things to the FSA. So we thought if we launched a free food fraud hotline, that would help. And we worked really closely with the food industry as we were developing our thinking on that. At the time, we were wondering, could we have a single line that all of industry used? And then we, of course, realised that there are a number of helplines and hotlines for things like modern slavery and so on. But we basically, with our food fraud working group, which was filled with lots of people from the food industry, agreed that this was the way to go. And we've got a new number. It's 0800 028 1180 if you're feeling that there's something you want to report. So I'll just say that again. It's 0800 028 1180. And that's going to get promoted across food businesses in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, where the FSA has jurisdiction. I mean, how can we ensure confidentiality and protection for whistleblowers? We take it incredibly seriously. The person who runs our National Food Crime Unit is an ex-National Crime Agency, an ex-police officer, and they have got a huge amount of experience of working with people who are providing intelligence into that space. And you can imagine in the organised crime space that people who are bringing intelligence into that, into officialdom, can feel quite vulnerable. So we take an enormous amount of care to protect people's identities and make sure that we're treating their information with due consideration and care. So, for instance, I don't get to find out who has been saying stuff to our food fraud hotline. It gets treated like intelligence. It then gets investigated thoroughly. And if we need to follow up, we do. So basically, I would just like to assure anyone who wants to get in touch to just report something that they feel uncomfortable about, that it's the right thing to do. And we will take it very seriously, and we will make sure that you get protected if you approach us.
Emily, the FSA has also strengthened information sharing arrangements with third-party auditors as a way to combat food fraud. How do you foresee this collaboration improving the detection and indeed prevention of criminal activity in food supply chains?
I tend to think of the way that the food regulatory system operates as having three lines of defence. So the first line of defence is food businesses themselves. The second line of defence is local authorities. The third line of defence is the Food Standards Agency and the fact that we sort of oversee the whole system. And that first line of defence, actually food businesses do a huge amount themselves to try and assure themselves that they're providing authentic food that is what it says it is to consumers. And they use a lot of third-party bodies to come and check stuff. And what we found last year was that there was all of that activity going on, people like BRC Global Standard and other third-party bodies going in, but there wasn't a protocol for information sharing with the regulator, either with us or with local authorities, if there was something really negative found. And I felt at the time that that just wasn't right. If there is criminality that's spotted or there's some kind of intelligence, there needs to be better information sharing. We had arrangements with other third-party auditors like Red Tractor, where they would absolutely share information with us, but we just didn't have that set up in a wider way. So what we did, again, through the food fraud working group that we worked with last year, was agree that we would strengthen the role that third-party assurance schemes play in passing on information to regulators. So they've initially agreed to share the details of food manufacturing businesses that have been removed from their schemes. Of course, being removed from schemes can happen for a number of different reasons, so we want to be sensitive to what the reasons are, but it's just really helpful to have that information come through to us because it's like a bit of intelligence we can then explore. And we're just working with them and the members of those third-party schemes to just see if there's any other opportunities on intelligence sharing in the future. We don't get, by any stretch of the imagination, all of the intelligence or all of the details that third-party auditors hold, but we want to build trusted relationships so that that vital intelligence can come through to us and we can act if needed.
It sounds like some real progress has been made recently in the fight against food fraud, but I wanted to pick up on some research that I found. It costs the UK an estimated $2 billion per year when it comes to food crime. So what additional measures is the FSA implementing to reduce this significant impact? And how do these measures benefit consumers, businesses, and regulators?
I think that might be from our own research, because we were looking at the cost of food fraud, and that sounds like a familiar figure. So we have a number of things, some of which I've already talked about, but the primary action against food fraud is food businesses. So they have a legal responsibility to provide food that is what it says it is. And one of the things I really admire about the UK food system is actually it's quite a compliant system. And I think retailers and food businesses generally take their responsibilities on this very seriously. And one of the things we want to do is just make that as easy as possible for businesses to do that. And local authorities are going and, as I said, in that second line of defence, they're going and checking what businesses are doing, but they may be on site one day a year or one day every couple of years. It's actually the food businesses themselves who need to do most of the effort. So, as I've said already, it's really important that people report stuff to us or share their concerns if they are anxious about things going on. The level of sampling that goes on, I think, is really good. And obviously, the more sampling, the better. Last year, about 50,000 samples were taken by retailers and manufacturers. And through the Food Industry Intelligence Network that was set up after the horse meat crisis about 10 years ago, that information gets shared with us in an aggregated, anonymised way so that we can see what kind of compliances and non-compliances are happening through that sampling. And that helps us know where the risk is. And then it helps local authorities focus on the risk too. And I think that intelligence picture also informs what retailers and manufacturers are looking at as well. And that really does inform our work on preventing and controlling food fraud. And then we've got our National Food Crime Unit. So the National Food Crime Unit, again, set up after the horse meat crisis. It's got about 80 people in, and there's a big team who do prosecutions and investigations, but there's also a team that do a lot of liaison with the food industry and prevention. And they've developed just free tools and guidance for businesses. They're all on our website, so food.gov.uk. And we have a food fraud resilience self-assessment tool. And already 500 businesses have gone through that and taken additional measures to prevent food fraud. And then the other thing we do every few years is we come out with a strategic assessment of food fraud and where we think the issues are. We're just working on our latest one at the moment, and that should be out quite shortly. That will help industry know where to look.
Thank you, Emily. I know food fraud is a big concern to new food readers and food industry members alike. So thank you for putting many minds at ease with that. If there's one thing that plays a key role in ensuring food safety in food and beverage production plants, it's hygiene monitoring. Our podcast sponsor Merck understands this and emphasises that attention to hygiene during the manufacturing process of food and beverage products is paramount due to the ever-present risk of dangerous microorganisms that can cause foodborne illness by infection or intoxication. As a way to minimise the contamination risk of products and personnel, Merck offers reliable and efficient solutions that have been designed in a way that routinely verifies the effectiveness of cleaning and disinfection practices for equipment, personnel, and high-touch surfaces, ensuring the highest standards of cleanliness and safety in your facilities. With increasing demands for food and beverage safety, Merck offers leading technical tips and training for in-process control testing. Their expertise can help you maintain top standards of safety and quality while still boosting production efficiency. To find out more about how you can partner with Merck to support your hygiene monitoring standards and optimize your food safety protocols, you can visit www.sigmaaldrich.com/HACCP. Back to the podcast. Now I want to turn our attention to an equally important topic. And as mentioned earlier, it is Allergy Awareness Week when we're recording this podcast. I want to touch on some of the work that the FSA has been doing to support those living with food hypersensitivity and indeed food businesses alike. A few weeks ago now, New Food reported that the FSA launched a campaign to highlight the risk of food labelled as vegan to people with allergies. Why was this clarification so important to the agency, and why now?
So we've done some consumer research, and that showed that consumers with food hypersensitivities were unaware that a vegan label on a food product or menu didn't mean that the product might still contain products of animal origin, which can be allergenic ingredients. And that's basically because of the cross-contamination risk. So in our consumer research, 62% of people who react to animal-based products or who buy for someone who is are currently confident or were confident that products labelled vegan were safe for them to eat, even though that was incorrect. Because the vegan label doesn't actually mean that there's no cross-contamination. It just means that there's no core ingredients of products of animal origin in there. And we also were getting insight through our food standards intelligence coordination network with local authorities that was coming up as an issue as well. So we just thought something needed to be done about it. And we were worried that the Vegan Society might not be very happy about us raising this, but they were really actually quite pleased that we'd flagged it and wanted to make sure that they weren't misleading consumers. We also had stakeholders like Anaphylaxis UK, Allergy UK, and the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation who were really supportive of the work. So we just thought we'd run a campaign on it. We worked with the Food and Drink Federation. We published guidance on allergen-free and vegan claims for consumers, which is on our website. And that's got some really clear guidance for food businesses on the difference between the 14 allergen-free claims, like milk-free, and vegan claims. So that hopefully explains it from a technical point of view. And then we've also just, in September last year, published updated food labelling technical guidance. And that offers best practices for food businesses when applying food labelling. So for instance, we would just encourage businesses to use a precautionary allergen label, such as a may contain statement, when producing vegan food if they can't rule out the risk of cross-contamination. There's just a difference between saying something is something free and something is vegan. And if you can't say that it's free, you need to use a may contain statement.
On the topic of disclaimers, back in December, the FSA confirmed that it is now backing Owen's Law, and it believes that written allergy information should be a legal requirement on menus rather than just as a guidance. Why is it so important, you think, that it should be a legal requirement rather than a guidance?
So this is something that our board considered at a couple of meetings last year, this question of written information to consumers. The FSA has a very transparent policy-making process. So our board meets in public 4 times a year. You can log on and watch it, or you can come in person and watch it. You can ask a question at the end. You can send questions in advance to it. And this question of written information to consumers was given a lot of quite deep consideration. And where the board got to was basically saying, okay, 2 million people in the UK have a food allergy or food intolerance or celiac disease. We've done a lot through the pre-pack for direct sale changes that come in a couple of years ago for that end of the market. But there's still this issue about what do you do if you're going into hospitality. And there is an expectation on the food business to provide information about what's in the food, but it can be written or spoken. We've done campaigns in the past to promote the idea of consumers asking for the information and reminding food businesses they need to provide it. But what Owen's Law was arguing was that there really did need to also be a sort of standard approach to written information. And we gave the board 2 options. One was that it would change what we inspect against. So the Food Law Code of Practice sets out what training standards and food hygiene inspectors need to do when they're going out to food businesses. And we thought we could tighten that up and have guidance and expectations about what should be done on written information, or to do a mandated approach. And the board basically said they wanted to support a mandated approach. And they felt that that was going to increase compliance more and create a better expectation with food businesses about what was needed. The thing to remember about this is that the FSA can't legislate. We don't have a minister. We're a non-ministerial department. We're deliberately separate from politics because we're there to be led by the science. So we have to persuade and advise ministers in Wales and Northern Ireland and England, where we operate, to change the law. So that this isn't a decision yet to change the law, because ministers would need to decide that. But the FSA board is advising ministers that they think this would be a good thing. So we're in the middle of doing some work on it. We're now thinking through how the written information might be provided. We're going to be doing some thinking through options for that over the summer. And then we're also pressing ahead in any case with giving guidance for local authorities and businesses for how the food standards inspections should happen. So basically, at the moment, food standards controls are the checks made by local authorities and district councils in Northern Ireland, so that food produced and sold by food businesses is what it says it is. And we're going to introduce a specific allergen information risk factor to that, which would consider compliance with allergen information requirements. And that would then be added to the food standards risk assessment. So there'll basically be more expectation happening even in advance of a mandated approach, that in those inspections, they'll be asking more about the written information and giving advice and expecting that to be happening. We know it'll take a while for this to get to ministers. There's a general election coming, but in the meantime, we wanted to do what we could through our Food Law Code of Practice.
This sounds really promising, Emily. Can you provide any update on correspondence with ministers, or is it, like you say, a relatively slow process?
I mean, our chair talks to ministers a lot in Wales and England and in Northern Ireland and has updated them on the board's views. We would need to offer more concrete advice. I mean, to do a bit of legislation, you need to do an impact assessment, make sure you consider the options, show the evidence and so on. Otherwise, Parliament is always a bit doubtful about what you're doing. So there's a lot of preparatory work to do. And then there's also just a question of parliamentary time. You have to persuade ministers to prioritise it. So current ministers know that this is where we're heading and what we'll be recommending. I think we'll need a general election to happen and then a new set of ministers to be in place. And then we'll be able to give our advice to them. And then it'll sort of be up to ministers what they decide in the different countries.
In your experience speaking to food industry professionals, how have they responded to Owen's Law?
There's such a lot of passion in the food industry about protecting people with allergens and food hypersensitivity. I feel like there's a real, just deep care that people have. I think they take their responsibilities largely very, very seriously. And I think cases like Owen Carey's are sort of very upsetting for people, because really when you're in the food industry, you're wanting to give people a lovely experience and a good time, and to have something like that where a young man, dies from an anaphylactic shock on his birthday from having something that he hadn't realised that he'd consumed. It's just gutting for people. So, and it's obviously awful for the family to have gone through that as well. So I think people really, really care and really, really want to get this right. What sometimes we get, though, is hospitality businesses who are quite worried about sort of unintended consequences. So they're worried about writing the information down and that not being accurate because of just how fast moving a kitchen is, or because of language barriers or whatever, and then misleading consumers into thinking that something is, they're just worried about inaccurate written information. So that's been one of the big bits of feedback, is how can we prevent that? And I think, but we had the same concern being raised over the Natasha's law, over the pre-packed for direct sale written information on labelling. And actually, I think it's a lot about really good discipline and learning and practice in kitchens. We offer training through our website, and in fact, we just promoted that through one of the delivery apps, who sent it out to all of their takeaways, and we had a massive upsurge in people doing our allergen training. I just think it's really important. It's not just about laws; it's also about practice and culture. And I think it is really important that food businesses take it seriously and make sure that their staff are trained and understand the significance of all of this.
It's really great to hear that from your experience, the sector is really passionate about supporting those living with food hypersensitivity. I know New Food reports on it a lot, and we actually have a dedicated mini podcast series talking about it, where we speak to Tanya Ednan-Laparose from the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, all about her story and the work that's been done to support those living with food allergies with Natasha's law. So I will link that in the description. Emily, zooming out slightly, looking ahead to the rest of 2024, what would you say is at the top of your agenda when it comes to ensuring a dependable and safe food system?
For me and for the Food Standards Agency, there's a lot that we just carry on doing. So we do our official controls work in abattoirs, we run our regulated products authorisation service, and we deal with food incidents day in, day out. There's over 2,000 a year of recalls and withdrawals and so on. So that just continues. So a big priority for me is making sure we do that well. And if there is a sudden food scare over something, a big issue, that gets handled well, and that we make sure the consumers are protected through the whole thing. The other thing that feels very shaping for 2024 is the fact we've got a general election coming. And our board in June in Llandudno is thinking about two big reform packages that they'd like to propose to an incoming set of ministers. One about the regulated products work that we do and how we reform that, and the other, it's called our Achieving Business Compliance programme, and it's really thinking through how we best work with local authorities for the inspections they do, and whether there's a different approach that's a bit more data-driven, where we could have a large enterprise data-driven inspection model that we're doing centrally. So we're bringing those sort of quite different, more 21st century ways of thinking about food regulation to our board in June, and just we're working heavily on that at the moment. And then we hope that the board will agree, and we'll be doing some development work on that later in the year.
Oh, well, I'm really excited to stay updated with exactly what the FSA is up to over the course of the next 12 months. One last question from me, Emily. Following your trip to Brussels, what is the one key takeaway you would like to share with New Food listeners when it comes to international cooperation in the food sector?
Well, actually, it was probably something that was to do with going abroad. You sort of get a mirror of what's happening in your own country, and it's just that I think we are quite a naturally compliant food industry. I think the supermarkets drive that in a significant way through their supply chains. I think our biggest manufacturing businesses largely take food safety and food authenticity very seriously. And it's just interesting sort of hearing an international perspective where people say, oh yes, of course, culture in the UK is very compliant. I think, oh right, I didn't really realise that, but that's really good to hear. So that's one of my takeaways. And in fact, it's reinforced by our annual report on food standards that we brought out in November last year, which does say that in spite of some very significant challenges that the UK has been facing around cost of living, around Brexit, around Ukraine, actually the food industry does largely manage to deliver safe food and authentic food for the UK consumer. So I just think that's something to be proud of, and that we need to It requires a lot of effort. It doesn't come effortlessly. We all have to put a lot of energy and attention into achieving that. So just, big thank you to everyone for doing that, and please carry on.
Emily, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating speaking to you, and it's been New Food's pleasure to have you on our podcast. It's been great to hear all about the work that the FSA has been doing to keep our food system as safe as it's ever been. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Food to Go, and a huge thank you to Merck for making these podcasts happen. You can find the entire back catalogue of our podcast episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts from. Once again, thank you to Emily for sharing your insight. It's been fantastic to have you on our podcast. But for now, that's all from me. Have a great week wherever you are, and stay tuned for the next episode of Food to Go.